Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs, where we are having a series on the book by Adam Smith on an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Thank you so much for joining us. So we have been doing a series and reviewing the book by Adam Smith. So far, we have done book 1, and we're in the process of doing book 2. Book 1 that consisted of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor. And we had 3 sessions that were undertaken in book 1, which you can catch up on IEA YouTube platform. And then we're having book 2, where we've had 1 session so far, chapter 1, 2, 3. And now we are doing discussions on chapter 4 and 5 of stock, lent at interest, and of the different employment of capitals. Generally, book 2 talks about the nature of stock, the effects of its accumulation into capital of different kinds, and the effect of different employments of those capital. So with me today is Leo Kemboi and Vivian Ochola, my colleagues from IEA. So Vivian will take us through chapter 4 of stock lent at interest, and Leo will take us through chapter 5 of the different employment of capitals. So feel free to enjoy as we dive into the conversation. So Vivian, you're welcome to start us off.
We are glad to be back again, chapter 4 of book 2. So, of stock lent at interest, that's the title. So if you are keen enough, you're able to notice that every chapter starts with of something. So that was the language that Smith liked very much. So chapter 4 of book 2, we are going to understand 4 important things. Number 1 is why people lend and why people borrow, what determines lending, unproductive and productive borrowing, and what is the best interest rate and what determines it. So those are the questions we are going to answer, or those are the things Smith is talking about in this chapter, and we are going to understand them very clearly according to his views. So chapter 3, we considered, or Kwame shared with us, some of the productive labor and unproductive labor. So productive labor, he said, it leads to accumulation of capital. So this series, they are continuous. So when capital is accumulated, what happens when someone or when the owner of that capital does not want to use it directly, but instead decides to lend it to someone else? So that is where interest comes in, and that is what we are going to talk about in this chapter. So stock is basically a form of capital. So a person who borrows it need to pay for it in form of interest. And we can simply say that interest rates are opportunity cost for holding cash. So if you decide to lend it and not use it or hold it, then interest rate must be paid on that. So why interest rate? So we have answered that. So it's because when someone lends capital, they give up using it themselves. So when I borrow someone my 1,000 USD, so I don't have that money to use it. So the borrower uses it to generate profit. Most of the time, people borrow to generate profit, though we'll understand other reasons why people borrow. Then the lender receives the portion of that profit as interest. So that brings us to the question, reasons why people lend. Why do people lend? It's because of the interest, which is a portion of the profit. They receive that interest, which is a portion of the profit. Then on the flip side now, why do people borrow money? There are majorly 2 reasons why people borrow money. Number 1, they borrow for capital, creation of capital. Like some people borrow money to pay workers or even to invest, then earn profits, then be able to share that profit as interest to pay back that loan. Then there's this other group of people that borrow for consumption. For them, he claims this is bad for the economy. If someone borrows money, do not use it productively, they just use it for consumption. He says this is bad for economy since it reduces the capital that is available to be borrowed. So let me read for you a quotation here that was very interesting. He said, reading, he said that the man who borrows in order to spend will soon be ruined, and he who lends to him will generally have occasion to repent of his folly. So Smith really didn't like, in his argument, he didn't like when people borrow to spend or to consume lavishly and not to spend it productively. So he says that anyone who borrows to spend that money will soon ruin himself. Then he brings us to the fourth thing, lending and its role to the economy. So that is at an individual level. Remember, we have said someone having capital and decides not to use it on himself but lend it to someone and receives a payment of interest rates. So what is the role of lending to an economy? So lending has its role to an economy as well. So does it really help to does it harm or help the economic growth? And Smith is telling us that lending do help economic growth only if it supports productive activity and when it's not for consumption. So it brings us to two arguments or two classification of borrowing. So he says that lending can be for productive or he says that there can be productive borrowing and unproductive borrowing. So productive borrowing uses a term called frugal. So means someone borrowing for things like in business investments, for employment creation and output expansion. Then now we have unproductive borrowing. For this type of borrowing, it's called prodigal borrowing, when someone borrows for consumption and even luxury spending. So when too much capital, then he says that when too much capital goes into consumption, capital is wasted. So he was so much against borrowing for consumption. Then he comes to the question that again we need to answer, or something you want us to know is what determines the amount of money available for lending. Then he explains that the amount of money available for lending is not determined, because there were arguments that people were saying that it is determined by the amount of money that exists. So he said it is not determined by the amount of money that exists, but by how much real wealth is available, amount of capital. So what determines that is the real wealth or the amount of capital available. Then so he rejects the notion that says that when there's more money in terms of coin or paper, during those time it was either coin or paper, it equals directly to more lending. So he rejects that fact. And he says that real capital, which is what determines lending, is basically real capital, which is goods produced in an economy, output from land and labor, and more was learned in chapter 3, then wealth that can support production. So those are the things that tend to determine borrowing, but not more money in terms of coin and paper in the economy. Then he gives an example. Let me read for you this an example. So in this example, he says that, for example, person A he has 1,000 euros, then he lends these 1,000 euros to person W. Then person W buys goods from B. Then B, because he has no need of this money, uses this money and lend it to person X. Then person X buy goods from person C. Then this same 1,000 euros, then person C lends to person Y. Then person Y buys from person D. So he says that what lenders really give, when we look at that example, is not really the money, but the command that money has over resources. So remember, person A has this money, then he lends to person W. Then now person W is not having the money, but the ability to command goods from person B. Okay, so he says that money is just a tool. So what is being transferred is the power to purchase goods. Then he brings us to something again. Why lending increase? Why sometimes lending is increasing, why sometimes it is low? So what makes it increase is when an economy is growing. So how do you measure when an economy is growing? When there's more goods that are being produced, then it implies more capital will be accumulated. Now, that brings us now when lending increase, we say that we talked about interest rates. Interest rates now comes in because of lending. Now, what determines interest rates? Why do they sometimes fall and sometimes rise? So what makes interest rates to fall? When there's more capital. So we said lending increases when an economy grows, then when it grows, more goods are produced and there's more capital. So when there's more capital, there's more lenders, people who want that money or that capital. Then when there are more lenders in the market, this drives competition in that particular market. And when there's competition, what happens when there's competition is that interest rates will now fall. Another reason why interest rate falls is when profit fall. So an increase in capital, it becomes even harder to find maybe profitable investments. Business competes with one another. Wages rise, they compete for labor. Wages rise, then profits shrinks. So lower profits in the long run leads to lower interest rate. So let me explain this simply in a chart. So assume you have a flowing chart. So when an economy is growing, it leads to more capital. So we see the flow. An economy is growing, it leads to more capital, then it lowers interest. So when interest rates are low, there's more competition. Many people will want to borrow cash because now the interests are favoring them. So after that, when there's more borrowing, there's more production. So when businesses and private investors are able to borrow more, they'll produce more. They'll produce more. Then as they produce more, they'll demand more labor. They'll demand more labor. And when in the labor market, when there's competition, there's demand for labor, the wages go up. In the long run, it lowers the profits because they pay more of their profit goes to payment of labor. So it lowers their profit. Then towards the end, it now lowers the interest rates. So that does not mean that growing economy is bad. It's okay for an economy to grow. Um, so it's just saying, what he's simply saying is that interest rate fall not because there's more money. He's nullifying the belief that interest rate fall because there's more money in the economy. No, he says that interest rates does not fall just because there's more money, but because of the changes in real economy, the changes that we have just seen. Then this brings us to whose theory is he criticizing? And we are finding out that he's criticizing mercantilism theory or the mercantilist theory. For them, they believe that more money uh, is equals to cheaper money, then finally lowers interest rate. So let me take you back to understand who are these mercantilists. So economic theory. So mercantilism is an economic theory from the 16th all the way to the 18th century. Sorry. So these people, they say that a nation's wealth is measured by its accumulation of gold and silver or precious metals like gold and silver. So they believe that if you accumulate more gold and silver, you are considered a wealthy economy. But Smith is nullifying that, is saying that accumulation of more gold and silver does not matter. What matters is the value of that money, what that gold and silver can command in the market. So he says, so the mercantilists, they focus on money as wealth, while Smith comes and say that he focuses on production and capital and investments as real wealth. Then he gives another example in the chapter, an example to prove to us that increase in supply of money does not equal low interest rates. So he gives an example of the Spanish West Indies. So who are these Spanish West Indies? So he says that these people refers to the Spain colonies in America, places like Peru and Mexico. So they had huge amount of gold and silver, which they were exporting to Europe at that time. So Remember, so there were more gold and silver, the silver that was flowing into Europe. So as a result of that, the interest became lower. Then there were three more. Their names are Mr. Loki, Mr. Lawe. So they associated that increase in gold and silver in Europe was directly linked to the fall of the interest rates, but it challenges them. He says that lower interest rate was not due to that increase in silver and gold. So he says that what happened is that more silver and gold makes them lose their value. So, and if it is worthless, lending it becomes even more worthless, and that is what in turn leads to lower interest rates. Then that takes us to something again. He gave an illustration in the same page. He's giving an illustration. So let's assume this situation. Assume that interest rates is 10% and you give a loan of 100 euros. So that means the interest someone is paying on that loan is 10. So after silver loses its value, or after gold and silver that comes into Europe loses its value. So it means when a money loses its value, it means that what 100 euros could buy then it is buying less. So assume 100 euros now buys what 50 used to buy. So money has lost half of its value. Then what should happen if the argument of the three men was correct? So what will happen is that if everything halves in value, so if 100 is like 50 now, is like 50 before, sorry, then 10% interest rate was like 10 euro interest rate that resulted from 10% was like 5 euros. So he said it's argues that now the relationship between capital and interest rate stays the same, but no, that's not the reality. So interest rates fall from 10% to 5%. So that same 100 euros that has fallen in value give an interest rate of 5 euros. So that is the connection. So interest has fallen, but more than just the value of money. So there's no connection, a direct connection between interest rates and the value of money. Then, in conclusion, he shifts now to the role of regulation in the lending market. He gives an example of countries that banned interest rates. So does it really work? Is it okay to ban interest rates? So he says that if you ban interest rates in a country, it does not stop lending, it makes it even worse. Why? People will still borrow. Lenders will still want compensation. So what will happen? They'll use the black market. So it becomes even more illegal and risky. So that result into usury. Then, but instead, he proposes that a country or the legal system should set a maximum legal rate. And this should be done carefully, because if it is too high, there's a problem. If it is too low, there's a problem. So let us understand that. So he says that the legal maximum rate should not be too low. Why? Because lenders will refuse to lend legally. Black market will happen, because when it is too high, when it is too low, it will be below the market price. It happened. The example of England, not England, but France. The law decided to set the interest rate below from 5%, which is the market interest rate, to 4%. We say that the market or the lenders found their way around and it went back to 5%. So it should not be set too low, because it will encourage illegal lending and it cannot override the market. Lower interest rate can never override the market. Then when it is too high, let's say the market is at 5%, then the legal system decide to set it at 8, maybe to 10%. What will this encourage? It will only encourage reckless, we call them reckless, prodigal, or projectors, who will accept those higher rates and use them to waste. And what will happen in the long run? Careful, productive investment won't borrow capital. So capital will be wasted on reckless and prodigal projectors. Then he ends this chapter by comparing land, which its reward is rent, and lending, which its rewards is interest rate. How they influence each other, how rent and interest rate influence each other. So he says that when interest rate falls, land become more attractive. When when interest rate falls, so people are attracted to land, then demand for land rises high. Then remember, when a demand for a certain commodity rises, it pushes up the prices. But when the interest rate is lower, the reverse happens. When it is high, when it is high, land becomes unattractive. People will go to land instead of buying land. Then demand falls, then price. So he gave, for example, if interest rate is at 10, that is on a higher side, demand for land falls. So it requires only 10 to 12 years of income or of labor to buy that land. But when interest rate is low at 5, the demand for land goes up, then it requires 20 to 30 years of labor to buy that same land. So it concludes by saying that when lower interest rates, higher land prices. So we compare those two, because when someone does not want to lend, he decides to choose to buy to buy land with that capital instead of lending it out, because now the interest rate is lower. So that is the conclusion of that chapter. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Melody.
Now we go to chapter 5 of the different employment of capitals.
So the bigger question from chapter of the different chapter 5 of the different employment of capital is that Smith was asking himself the structural question: how does the employment of capital affects the wealth of a nation? And he is asking himself this question and he first starts by giving an analogy that capital can be employed in 4 different ways. One, either as procuring in procuring the root produce annually for the use and consumption of the society. Second, in manufacturing and preparing that root produce for the immediate use and consumption. And then the third is that in transporting that manufactured produce from places where they are bound to those places where they are wanted. And the fourth question is dividing particular portions of those either into small parcels. So he's looked at the economy, and the economy at that time was what you could say largely agrarian. So he divides capital into 4 areas, which is agriculture, what you'd say manufacturing, third is wholesale trade, and then the fourth question is the retail trade. And as part of agriculture, you observe that to employ capital, you require capital to cultivate land, to raise livestock, and so that produces that then the annual production forms the basis of that the national produce of the land. Then he observes that these 4 methods essentially is essentially necessary to the existence of the other 3. So he's saying that for agriculture, you have to farm, and once you've farmed, then you are required to now deploy that capital to transform that raw material into finished goods. Then you'll be required again to transport it, to transport it, and trade at that time was a bigger component of the economy, and then split also those into portions that are required. And then so he observes, and so for example, when he makes the argument about the core argument from that is that different employments of capital gives motion to different quantities of productive land. Because to explain that capital does not just sit passively, it activates labor. But what Smith observes is that the quantity of labor activated depends on the sector. And he goes to give different kinds of examples that that it depends on labor, because he gives that example that the persons whose capital are employed in 4 ways are themselves productive laborers. Their labor, when properly directed, fixes and realizes itself in the subject of the commodity of the vendible commodity upon which it's bestowed. So the profits of the farmer, of the manufacturer, and the merchant, and the retailer are drawn all from the price of goods which the first two produce and the last two buy and sell. So equal capital employed in each different ways gives different quantities of productive labor, and that's his broader argument. The second key question that he provides is that he notices that when he says so when the productive labor is the only one that results in that vendible commodity, that commodity that can be sold. And the question becomes, which sector generates more vendible output per unit capital? And then he does some analysis and comes to the conclusion that the most productive employment at that time when Smith was writing this was agriculture, because he makes the argument that agriculture puts into motion the greatest quantity of productive labor. And then he gives that it produces a net supply of output, and it combines that human labor and natural fertility of the land. So that nature assists labor in agriculture, and outputs exceed the mere replacement of inputs. So then he provides another analogy that manufacturing is also productive, but it's secondary. It creates more value, but through not just labor and skill, but also the division of labor. We covered the division of labor in sessions of the previous series. So it's productive, but not primary in its hierarchy. And then on trade, Smith says that it's necessary, but non-productive in output terms, because he writes that capital in trade, I'm looking for that specific passage. The capital in trade does not fix itself or realize itself in any particular subject or vendible commodity, and that trade does not produce new goods. It only circulates existing ones. So it moves goods between producers and markets. Wholesale being that it moves between the merchant trade at that time, called merchants, moves goods between producers and markets, and also the retail trade distributes goods to consumers, but it doesn't increase the physical stock of output. So that's why the implicit hierarchy is that agriculture, manufacturing, and then wholesale. Then Smith notes something that is very important up to today, that capital, the way capital resides. So in agriculture and retail trade, you note that capital must reside within that society. The employment is confined to almost precise spot, to the farm, to the shop, to the retailer. Then he observes again that the exception, the capital for a merchant, on the contrary, does not have no fixed or necessary residence anywhere. So mobility of capital. In here, Smith discusses the question of mobility of capital. And then similar to manufacturer, capital must reside where manufacturing is carried on. But and he gives an example so between Edinburgh and he gives that Lyons, which in France is very distant, but from which places which affords the material of its manufacturer and those that consume them. The people in Sicily, Italy, which is also far from Edinburgh, are clothed in silk made in other countries from materials which it produces. Part of the whole of Spain is manufactured in Great Britain, and that some part of that cloth is sent afterwards back to Spain. So mobility of capital is not necessarily, it's not resident in one area. Then the key argument from Smith, the key argument from Smith is that capital is not equally produced across those sectors. Some of uses of capital expand real output. Others only move output around. So, and he gives those examples like trade and manufacturing. So some of those we can summarize the key principles from Smith's from Smith's book is that capital we just mentioned the one that capital is not equally produced across sectors. Productive labor is the unit of economic value, and and then he gives the sectoral lens, and then he makes the argument that later is contextualized by Solo, which is the national wealth depends on annual produce of land and labor. And that in implication is that wealth is the flow of real goods produced annually. So thank you so much. I end at that. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo, for breaking down chapter 5 for us and helping us understand more the different employment of capitals. So maybe to ask Vivian, how is interest, in what pathway does interest make a nation wealthier? What pathway does interest follow to make a nation wealthier?
Thank you. If I got you correctly, you say that what path do an interest rate follows to make a nation wealthier? So from what I got and what I understand is that interest rates should be set at a level that is not more above the market rates and even more below the market rates, so that it can be able to be, so that productive lenders, because what Smith is arguing is that borrowing is okay, but when someone borrows and does not use that capital for productive purposes, it shrinks the capital and it makes a country not to become wealthier. So when interest rates are set at a rate whereby productive borrowers, even maybe people want to start a business, people want to use it on employment and all that, when they are able to borrow and be productive in the economy, it will lead to an accumulation of more capital that will help a nation to grow wealthier. So the notion that now when there's increase in money supply or when there's more gold and silver in an economy, it will automatically makes a country wealthy. No, what makes a country wealthy is when there's enough capital that can be productive enough to accumulate more capital for the next, maybe for the next person to borrow. Yeah.
So on a follow-up question, Vivian, you've said Adam Smith thinks that there should be regulation. There's a role that government should play in regulation of interest rates. Do you think that's still relevant in our current market?
Yeah, it is. It is still relevant because when I read this chapter, what came to my mind is monetary policy, because it deals with regulating interest rates to ensure that uh, private sectors and even governments are able to borrow. So it is still relevant. So why it becomes a problem is when the CBK sets a rate that is so high to an extent that private sectors who borrow to invest and all that are unable to borrow. So, and now who will be able to borrow? Governments. We know in our lending and even internal borrowing, governments do borrow at a high interest rates because they need that money urgently. So it crowds out the private sectors. So these things are still applicable today. So in as much as for Smith's core idea was that interest rates are determined by real factors in the economy, like we said, capital, which is savings, profit, investments, and opportunity cost. Now, where a central bank comes in the modern day is now central bank do a monetary policy, and how it does it, it do set the CBR rates either for tightening or expanding of the economy by setting higher interest rates or lower interest rates. So, so we see the connection. Smith was majorly focused on the forces behind interest rates either falling or increasing now, and the central bank is now interested. So it influences interest rates through policies. Yeah, so it's still applicable today, though the method is a bit different because central bank influences the interest, but Smith looked at the forces behind that are not seen, the forces behind the interest rates without the influence of the central bank. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. Leo, do you have any follow-up thoughts on that, considering that there's a time in the previous administration they attempted to cap interest rates? Do you have any follow-up? Should government have a role in the regulation of interest rates?
Government should not regulate interest rates. The market should determine what rates exist, because this is cost of capital. And the cost of capital, the only thing that government can do is to allow macroeconomic fundamentals to play right, which is now that because, for example, interest rates now is a factor of whether fiscal expansion, it's a factor of the inflation plays a factor, because, for example, when inflation is too low, real rates go up. So it's something that interest rates from a macroeconomic standpoint, that interest rates should not largely should not be regulated. What should be regulated is the conduct, which is the conduct of, for example, like the real interest rate could be 7, let's say, for example, single digit, 9%. But those specific lenders add hidden fees or something like that of similar sort. That is what we call market conduct, which is specific players playing around. But when government interest, and if we look the IEA's master data on monetary policy, shows that when government of Kenya, for example, passed the interest rate cap law in 2016, private credit collapsed. and you see it from data, because no one is willing to give capital where the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. So that is Econ 101. So that's the point that we try to make too, that only the regulators should only look at conduct, but to regulate interest rates is not something that a regulator should consider. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. So, Leo, on chapter 5, do you think Adam Smith's view on the deployment of capital, on the employment of capital, is it still relevant in our society today?
So some sections are, some sections are not. So, for example, it gives this view that capital, the most productive sector, for example, to deploy capital would be in agriculture, and that in itself, that given given the fact that that is a society that he was in at that time, that is different. We know that most service sectors, for example, are some of the most productive sectors, and service sectors in this case did not form part of his analytical capability. So, for example, you could train a chip engineer, and you would have a 5-year contract of $100 million. So that could be 100 years of more than 100 years annual revenue for an SME in Kenya. So a micro, small, medium enterprise. So at that time, those are some of the things that you see. But there are things that it makes a very like on mobility of capital. Capital is not resident in one area. So capital moves. And policymakers, especially in this country, tend to have a perspective that capital is only resident in specific. You can do something, but capital doesn't move. So, for example, he makes an observation that the merchants, that capital is not resident within that area, and that subject has advanced because at one level, people can look at capital moves across jurisdictions effortlessly because of the extent of the deepening of financial markets, the extent of different sets of instruments, among other things. So you start to see that the fact that you recognize that mobility of capital, and that is something that we could see. The second issue that I think is still relevant today is that he makes this observation at the last paragraph in that chapter, that the consideration of the private profit is the sole motive in which the owner of capital determines whether, for example, to employ it either in agriculture, manufacturing, retail, or wholesale. And that is one of the most powerful. So capital, deployment of capital. So when we look at even the way capital is deployed, when we discuss the macroeconomic fundamentals and look at, say, for example, whether accumulation of private investment or private capital, the main determinant is still that gain, that marginal benefit that comes from that deployment of capital. So it's not, you could be patriotic, for example, and say, we want people to invest in our tea or in our coffee or specific things that like to see. But in the end, that in itself that is not the consideration. The consideration is that private profit, and that is the sole motive. So that is something that is true in 1776 and is true in 2026. That is something that is still salient and stands out, and that forms the basis for that incentive for that. So thank you.
Thanks, Leo. So the last round of questions. Vivian, based on chapter 4 of the Stock of Lent and Interest, what advice would you have for policymakers based on what your review of chapter 4? What advice would you give based on what you have read from chapter 4?
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'll agree with what Leah said. Let the markets determine, because you cannot really influence. I said a point whereby when laws can never override the market, the forces of demand and supply will always find a point of equilibrium. So the regulation should let the market be and not set interest rates higher to an extent that creditors or those who want to borrow for the sake of developing the economy are not able to borrow, because it will lead to black markets. We've seen that in our mobile money lending and all that, how people are being manipulated because of the high interest rates. So what we need to do, let the market be, and the forces of demand and supply will determine the equilibrium, and don't set the minimum or the maximum interest rates. Yeah.
Thanks, Vivian. Leo, what policy advice would you give to policymakers based on the chapter you've read?
The extent of which capital is employed, because the employment of capital is something that is determined largely by the consideration of private profit, and therefore it is that the environment that gives adherence to this rule provides the employment of more capital. Second issue is that capital is mobile, and capital capital is mobile, and therefore it is not enough to limit the movement of capital. So it's about the question of what kind of equilibrium mix of the policy tools would give an environment where more capital comes to that jurisdiction. The third issue that I would give is that sectors are different, and these sectors are dependent. That consideration of private profit actually predetermines which sector. In this case, when Adam Smith was alive in that 1776, the most dominant sector that could absorb more capital at that time was agriculture. We know that is not true today. And therefore, it's important for us to keep to be open-minded that the extent and the complexity of economies grow over time. And that is the most important thing, that this is a piece of text that was written 250 years ago. But as some things have stood the test of time and others have not. And then the most important thing is the emphasis on private trade, on merchant trade. At that time, Adam Smith could see that wool that comes from Spain, that clothes would be manufactured in England and then turned back again to Spain over that period. So the global value chains concept is more than 200, was still relevant then and still relevant today. So limiting trade, whether in forms of quotas or non-tariff barriers or whichever forms of licensing restrictions, or any instrument that seeks to curtail growth, is something that policymakers need to be cognizant of, that trade is something, a value chain approach to trade is more important, and farms need to be subjected to to those forces of trade, which is the most effective form of competition. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leo. We're coming to the end of our discussion, so I'll give you 1 minute each to make your concluding remarks, then we end our conversation. I'll start with Vivian. Make your concluding remarks, then Leo.
Thank you very much, Melody. So what I noticed while reading this chapter is Smith really hates people who borrow to spend. Maybe he was writing during those periods where there were no credit cards. Maybe if he was living in our days, he could be shocked and see how people borrow money to buy, to even they borrow to pay loans and a lot of things. So yesterday we were discussing with my colleague Fiona, asking ourselves, if I borrow money to buy a car, is that, according to Smith, is that correct? Then for him, he'll answer you and tell you that only if that car will generate income. But if it is a car for luxury, then you are wasting resources. So he really hated it when people borrow. Though I tend to, from his argument, his concern is about accumulation of capital, and it is very important if you borrow money, use it for something that is profitable, because the person who lends will want interest. So how are you going to pay back that money if it is not generating a profit, which a share of it should go back as interest rates? So it is a very interesting discussion. I hope each one of us will enjoy this chapter even as we continue. Thank you.
As for me, the key thing is that the deployment of capital is an important component in the economy, and both for growth and absorptive capacity, and also that this is capitalism allows that productive is the most important, that productive unit of the economy to function. Secondly, for me, is the fact that the extent of development and complexity of the economy is that capital is not just deployed in areas where the physical goods are produced. As we know now that services form an important part of the economy. And third is the question about a country's system that allows more trade to function, and that makes a recognition that there are certain specific areas of the economy you'd gain comparative advantage and not the others. And all this comes from that different employment of capital. So these different sectors have different forms of implication. And the lastly thing, the foundational problem in economics is expanding output and, but most importantly, expanding labor. So, and these forms a big part of this discussion on how capital is employed. So, capital and labor go hand in hand. The most productive and the most capital-intensive sectors all exist and coexist together. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Vivian and Leo. So, in summary, what I've the insight I have gained from your discussion is that for a nation to grow or to be wealthier, we need to borrow to produce, and we need to deploy capital in areas where, in the most productive sectors. In a nutshell, that's what chapter 4 and 5 is all about. So thank you, Leo and Vivian, for that great review and for the good discussions that we've had. And thanks everyone for future watching this series. So we are done with book 2. The next session we'll have is on book 3, where we'll have discussions from chapter 1 to chapter 4 with my colleagues. So stay tuned, and hope we've continued sparking your interest to read through The Wealth of Nations. Thanks, and have a good time.